Welcome everyone to this first session on financial capability and well-being for in a climate of uncertainty. This webinar is brought to you by the Center for Financial Wellbeing, and I'd like to start our webinar today by acknowledging that I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge NAIDOC Week, a wonderful week of celebration of First Nations achievements, which we are so proud of our heritage here in Australia. The topic today, financial well-being and resilience in a climate of uncertainty. When we first started looking at this concept, say about 20 years ago, we used to talk about financial inclusion, which was about making sure that people have access to safe and affordable finance. But given all of the things that have happened in the financial landscape since then, it's actually becoming really important to broaden the view on financial inclusion to not just be about access, but also about building resilience, managing shocks that happen in the global financial system, as well as ensuring well-being. And a lot of the latest research is actually talking about happiness. How do you manage money so that it makes you happy? And on that note, we have some wonderful panelists who are going to share their experience in financial capability building and well-being. So I'll hand over to our wonderful board director, Anna Perera-Shaw, who's also the associate director at Nature, and let her introduce our panelists. Over to you, Anna.
Thanks very much, Vinita, for that introduction. I'm looking forward to our discussion, and today I'm moderating our discussion from the land of the Darug and Guringai people, and I pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. So with me on the panel today is Phillip, Usher, and Adam Fair, and I think it's best if I hand over to each of them to talk through kind of their background, as there's a wealth of experience behind both of them, and I don't know if I'd be able to do it justice kind of just reading out a bio. So Phil, I might start with you if you would like to introduce yourself and your background, please.
Yeah, sure. Phil Usher, Wiradjuri man, grew up in Gumbarroo country in Tamworth, so much more connected to mob out that way. Running my own consultancy, Gunagal Consulting, and we're really focusing on that economic lens for First Nations people at the moment. We see there's been a lot of conversation around social issues, but I think there's a big opportunity to take community and First Nations people and kind of shift that conversation to one more around economics and the opportunity for empowerment more so than social. Up until recently, I was a CEO of First Nations Foundation, where we did financial education and wellbeing training for communities right across Australia. That included our training around financial fitness, just getting mob kind of up to scratch with their financial education, right through to our financial wellness week, where we'd go out to communities and connect mob with superannuation that they kind of forgotten about or didn't know they had. And that number sort of when I'd left over, a 10-year period of running the program. I was there for 5 of those, but it was about $30 million in super that we'd connected with community. So that's one of the programs that's still going well. And we sort of expanded that as well to include other financial services. So we used to take banking out there. One community, we issued 35 birth certificates to help, progress with identification, which then helped with superannuation. So yeah, very, very good achievement from the team and everyone involved.
Awesome. Thanks, Phil. That's definitely some good context for some of the questions that I'll be asking you later on today as well. Now, Adam.
Yeah, very happy to be here, Adam Fair, and I'm calling in from Toronto, Canada, and really appreciate the opportunity to share a bit more with you about our experience in Canada. And so I'm Adam Fair. I'm the VP of Strategy and Impact at Prosper Canada. I've been here for about 18 years and really seeing the organization grow and the field of financial well-being and financial resilience grow. And so we're really an organization whose mission is to expand economic opportunity for Canadians living in poverty. And we do that both through program and policy innovation. in short, we're really trying to figure out what might be holding households back in terms of achieving greater financial well-being and security, and what are the programs, policies, and industry practices that we could be putting in place to help people do better. And there's a lot of work to do. So it's been keeping us busy. And I think it's something, especially since the pandemic and the affordability crisis, that's on the mind of many stakeholders across the country of how do we make sure we're helping households that might be struggling financially, and what can we do collectively and individually to support people get back on their feet.
Great. Thanks, Adam. And thanks for joining us in your evening. A bit of a time zone difference there, but appreciate that. And as Vinita mentioned in her introduction, we are in a rapidly changing economic and political landscape, and this can make financial wellness and resilience even more challenging, and something that we're talking more and more about. According to recent research commissioned by or conducted by Nature, there's 1 in 3 Australians who are currently concerned about cost of living, particularly those under 30 who are particularly concerned. So this demographic are also concerned about losing their jobs, and this is something that we saw coming out a little bit more strongly after the pandemic, where people who previously may have had secure employment experienced loss of job they didn't expect, and also just more concerns about financial security, having that emergency fund available, and being prepared for unexpected challenges. And that really ties in with our topic of financial resilience. And this is something that we know is an important topic, but I'd love to hear from both of you in terms of especially the Australian context and the Canadian context as to why financial resilience is important. And as Vinita mentioned in the beginning, we used to talk about financial inclusion, but well-being and resilience are becoming kind of more key, I guess, to some of the strategies and the actions that are being considered in terms of what's needed to happen to make this better and really help people be more resilient to unexpected changes. So Adam, from the Canadian perspective, it would be great to hear why financial resilience is something that we should be speaking about and thinking about.
Yeah, I think it's always been important, but I think now more than ever, it feels like it's hit kind of a critical pitch and something that we need to really be prioritizing. I think there's really significant disruptions that are happening all around us, that are leading to real challenges in terms of how households and individuals achieve greater financial security and resilience. Even before the pandemic, and Canada, like Australia, is dealing with an affordability crisis, indicators as it relates to financial health and well-being were going in the wrong directions. A lot of households were really struggling with high debt levels, low savings levels, and many people were struggling with poverty. And before the pandemic, few stakeholders were asking the questions why the indicators were moving in that direction, what was leading to that, and what could we be collectively doing, and what could different sectors be doing to help people achieve greater financial inclusion and security. And I think, like was you mentioned and others mentioned at the beginning, historically we'd been thinking about this issue more in terms of an access problem, or maybe about a knowledge challenge that people didn't have enough knowledge to be able to make good financial decisions. I think it's becoming crystal clear that although knowledge plays a role and access plays a role, there's just larger forces at play that are making it harder for Canadians, and Australians in some cases to get ahead. And so I think we're really keen to figure out, what are these different forces and how can we make sure that we're helping people move forward in a good way. As affordability challenges persist and the economic outlook in Canada is unclear, we're navigating, as you know, trade negotiations with the US and beyond. There's a lot of uncertainty right now. And so I think this is a great time for us to be collectively centering and prioritizing financial well-being and figuring out what the role for policymakers, what the role for industry and financial services could be, and how community organizations could be better supporting households that are financially struggling to get back on their feet and build longer-term resilience. So the moment feels very important, and one that we and others are really trying to make sure that everyone's keeping an eye on what these disruptors are doing, how that's leading to household outcomes, and how we could all be collaborating actively to find solutions.
Yeah, excellent. And that's something that I'll certainly ask you a little bit later as well in terms of the specific approaches that you're taking and some of the actions that you think are particularly effective as well. Phil, what are your thoughts on financial resilience, particularly with that Australian context?
I think for the First Nations context, it's the missing piece in our closing the gap targets. So we look, broadly, we're looking at interactions with the legal system. We've got justice, we've got health, education, employment, safer communities, early childhood. I think the connection between all of that comes down to a financial resilience one. And there's strong data that shows that people, the better off they are financially, the better they are in those other areas. Particularly healthcare, which is a massive issue for First Nations people. It's no secret that money helps a lot with that health space, particularly when you're starting to go to specialists, and particularly when you're coming off country and going to a bigger city where those specialists are. Having the access to finances and resources can really help get that support that you need at those important times. So for me, it's that missing link that probably needs to be spoken about a bit more, particularly at a government and political level, because it really ties everything together. Even looking at our justice system, there's probably no secret that the more money you have, the better legal advice that you can afford, and not kind of go through some of the challenges that our mob have gone through. So having that financial resilience piece really can elevate those other closing the gap challenges. And we've seen the data, even though it's 2019, the Money Stories report, the really only research that exists around financial resilience for First Nations people. And given that was before the pandemic, I assume it's gotten a lot worse, but something like 53% of First Nations people have no savings at all. I think issues like that are really concerning, because even that we're pushing employment and we're pushing the closing the gap agenda. If you lose your job, or you're going from 5 days a week down to 4 or 3, and you've got no savings, then you're quickly going back into kind of that hardship area. So that we need to talk about that long-term financial sustainability when we're talking about this concept as well.
Absolutely. And I guess you mentioned as well, access kind of ties in with finances. If you have the financial buffer, you're more prepared when there's an emergency or something unexpected comes up. Access to, services that maybe help you in the legal system. There's a lot that ties in. And I think that's something really important when we think about financial wellness, financial inclusion, financial resilience. There's this toolkit that literacy can enable, but then the wellbeing and the resilience, it's the ability to adapt or have that buffer when things happen. And I think people can underestimate that sometimes when they sort of have that buffer, and they can pivot quite quickly, and how challenging it is when you don't have that in place. Now, as Vinita mentioned, it is NAIDOC week this week. So the theme for the week is the next generation: strength, vision, and legacy. And Phil, you have an amazing legacy from your time leading the First Nations Foundation, with a big focus on intergenerational wealth building for First Nations people and reconnecting people with significant amounts of lost super, like you mentioned with your introduction. Can you talk us through why intergenerational wealth building is so critical to First Nations people in particular, and what your vision is for the future with this?
Yeah, it gives us the opportunity for a generation not to start behind the 8 ball for the first time in probably the history of First Nations people. So just a quick snapshot of like a retirement landscape. You have a look at the 3 pillars of retirement in Australia: superannuation, personal savings, our age pension system, and then you generally want to own your own home as well. And those elements are considered important for good retirement. At the moment, only 42% of First Nations people own their home. You can't access super until you're 60 if you retire completely, or 65 if you're still working, and you can't access the age pension until you're 67. The issue with all that is the life expectancy for an Aboriginal male is 71. So in the current state of play, and we look at it holistically, First Nations people not really having that wealth, because we don't hit many of those criteria or access many of that criteria in retirement. So we've got this opportunity where we can start to build this intergenerational wealth, where we're not so reliant upon waiting to we're 65 or 67 to access an income stream. We can kind of work particularly with the younger kids about building that wealth and building the alternate income stream, so we're not having to, I think, rely on those later stages. The other aspect that I think goes unnoticed as well is the opportunity to pass on that wealth. So if we're not accessing superannuation at those later stages, there's the opportunity to put it into estate planning and pass that money on to families so they can then access it. So we kind of got the two parts of people now that probably won't enjoy the superannuation in the full intent that it's supposed to because of the health issues and the age, the life expectancy gap. There's an opportunity for an estate planning piece there, but for the younger ones to build something up and not really have to worry about, am I going to live to see it? You can start to enjoy that work at a much younger age.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that is, I think, quite a unique topic that you've really focused on with your work in terms of really highlighting the opportunity to build wealth, not just build a financial buffer, but actually build that wealth that you can secure for the future and for yourself as well, for not just for your future kids, but also for you as an individual who's earned the money to kind of enjoy for the future and enjoy now. And I think that really ties in with the resilience as well, building up those savings and having that buffer for when things that are unexpected do arise. Now, Adam, it'd be good to hear from you from the perspective of Prosper Canada. There's a focus on expanding the economic opportunity for Canadians, particularly living in poverty, and there's a lot of work being done with Prosper, working with governments, business, and communities to support those who are financially vulnerable. Can you talk us through the particular approaches that you're taking to help build financial wellbeing for Canadians?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I think we're taking a bunch of different roles to try and build household financial well-being. In some ways, we are further behind Australia and some other countries in terms of the progress that's been made. But I think we're also making some good progress across the country, and the ecosystem of partners is starting to grow. I'd say first off, we play a fairly similar role, although not quite as structured as Financial Counselling Australia, in the sense that we're really trying to scale, community delivered financial counseling and what you would frame as financial capability services. And so we're starting to make sure that across the country, no matter what community you're in, there's community support for you to help if you're struggling with your finances and to help you build greater financial security and well-being. Most recently, the federal government has made a $60 million over approximately 4 years investment to help expand these services, which we think is, again, not at the level of Australia, but a good step in the right direction to make sure that there is that base foundation of support across the country. We want to make sure that as we're building out this service system of financial counseling and financial capability services and supports, that we're thinking about inclusive access to particular groups that have been historically excluded. And we've done quite a bit of work, and we'll continue to prioritize our work with Indigenous peoples and peoples with disabilities and Black Canadians and other vulnerable groups. We also want to make sure that the services that we're developing and scaling are not just going to work for people that live in larger service centers and cities, but also work for rural and remote regions. I think one thing that we share with Australia is a pretty big geography, and in many circumstances, it can be a pretty sparsely populated areas across the country. And so we want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to get help if they need it. Alongside our work to expand practice and services on the ground, we're constantly trying to inform government and advocate for more policies and regulations that improve financial well-being. And those roles are interconnected. We're working in community, we're working in the front line, we're seeing how policies are working or not working for Canadians. And then we can work with those organizations and people that are financially struggling to be able to both hold up a mirror and shine a light to where policies and services are falling short, and also come with some ideas in terms of how consumer protection and the social safety net could be strengthened and improved for individuals. An issue that we spend quite a bit of time with that may be less of an issue in Australia, but I'm not quite sure, is really even helping people connect to government benefits. It's conservatively estimated that $2 billion gets left on the table every year because people face barriers in terms of accessing the benefits that they're eligible for. So a key objective for us and our partners across the country is letting people know about these benefits and helping them access those so we can help people boost their income and improve their financial situation. And then finally, we're trying to really catalyze conversations across sectors around deepening understanding in all different sectors around these issues and how we could collectively be building solutions to drive more action as a collective across the country. And so this is having us facilitate conversations across sectors, bringing in government, bringing in financial service representatives, bringing community-based organizations, again, to figure out what's holding Canadians back and how we can do better. And I think, the financial services sector is starting to engage more, but they've been a little bit slower to really prioritize some of this work. But we're seeing some promising signs of more engagement on that side. And also the federal government and provincial governments continue to show interest in this space. So we're quite excited about the opportunity to work collectively to drive change in many of these areas.
That's interesting when you mentioned the kind of collaboration and the opportunity with money that's available, for example, government benefits that are just being left behind. And I think that's a really interesting strategy to make sure people can access, at a starting point, make sure they can access the money that is available for them. And then also thinking about the role of financial services. And that's something that I'm sure in Australia, Canada, many contexts, there's different initiatives, different use of technology, different leadership that has been, helping create change or potentially meaning that change is slower than it could be. But really interesting to just think about that collaboration, and might be something we can touch on at the end as well in terms of the kind of roles to play in the different groups. But yeah, really, really good context there. And Adam, you mentioned the financial capability element, but what do you see as the benefit when financial capability and well-being is improved, but also what do you think needs to happen to make a greater impact?
Right. And I think, building off what Phil said, I feel like this work around financial well-being has been to some degree like missing in plain sight. It's the missing ingredient often. And it's curious that it was missing in Australia. It feels like to a degree it's been missing in Canada. But often, you'll hear all sorts of issues around housing security or food insecurity or employment challenges. But what you don't often hear is how underneath those presenting issues is a vulnerability on people's financial well-being and resilience. And I think when you start bringing in the conversation, both in terms of like, how do we help people become housing, secure in terms of their housing, their employment, and their food, I think financial well-being and security have to be part of those conversations. And often they're missing. And we see that, quite often in our social services across the country, and even in the models that government and funding models and policy and program models that government is advancing, they seem to consistently miss this piece. So I think there's an opportunity to sort of, again, center this work and show how it not only is an end itself, but a contributing factor. When you dig into the research on the drivers of food security, income security, financial well-being become the number one drivers for many of those outcomes. So we can't separate them. So for us, when we think about building financial security for households and for individuals, it's really around how do we make sure that everyone has an opportunity to succeed in this economy? What are those pathways that young people are supposed to be taking? How can we be behaving in our working age to make sure that we're not only getting by today, but positioning ourselves for longer term security? And like we've been saying, I think once you achieve greater financial well-being, financial inclusion, financial resilience, it has all these other positive social knock-on effects around health, food, happiness, housing, employment. They're all interconnected. So I think that's the real opportunity for thinking about how to make sure that individuals and households are financially included. And then I think when we kind of pan out a little bit and think about the community level, it's really important to make sure that households are doing well, because if you add up all the households, that's really the economic situation and social situation for those communities and for your country. And so if inequality continues to drive forward, if people continue to struggle with debt and not being able to save, you're going to see that show up in all sorts of other indicators around people struggling with social inclusion, economic issues, broader health and cultural challenges. And so I think there's just a real opportunity to make sure that we continue to say, how are households doing? Not just at the macro level, but at the micro level, how are households doing and how can we make sure that everyone has an ability to benefit from the economy? And I do think this is an opportunity for countries like Australia and Canada to really start to create a model to make sure that within what feels like a very ever-changing economic and social landscape, we're building an economy that works for everybody. And we're thinking about that every day in terms of the design of our economy. Because it seems like we're kind of moving away from that a little bit. The economy is working for some and not working for most. And so we need to continue to come back to that principle of making sure that our policies, our practices, our services are making sure that everyone gets to be included and everyone has an opportunity to thrive.
Yeah, and a great point about how it all ties together, financial security, helping with health. Vinita's done a lot of work on in terms of identifying the relationship between there's, your financial health, your mental health, your emotional health, your physical health, there's housing, food security, all these factors that tie in and also relate to what you can afford. And it's kind of, this challenging dynamic with how to achieve that. But I think a really good point to highlight just how interconnected it all is in terms of outcomes. And if you kind of step back and just see how tied up it all is, it's financial capability and resilience and well-being is clearly such an important area to improve. Phil, anything to add on this topic?
I think this is one piece for an Australian context that would be really helpful is going through it's almost some economic truth telling for two reasons. One, I think the broader financial service sector needs to know, but the second and most importantly, it's a really healing process for First Nations people. A number of money workshops we'd run, and we'd start by talking about the history of where Aboriginal people were placed on reserves and missions and were paid in rations rather than money, or if it was money, they were told how to spend it. Exclusion from the workforce. We got the modern program with the cashless debit cards. We haven't had the opportunity to really manage our own money. And this is a kind of the first opportunity now, the first generation where they've grown up without sort of those issues, excluding the cashless debit card. So I found there was like a real, like a real moment of clarity when we talk about that in our sessions, saying, we're not bad with money because we're Aboriginal. It's this history of economic exclusion where we haven't had the opportunity to manage money before, and this is kind of our first go at it. So when we look around the community, and the financial plan is to get social housing because it's secure and predictable, and the disability support pension because it's kind of income for life. That's all you've ever known, and that's all the government's kind of wanted, in the 60s and 70s with their policies. Once we go through and have those conversations with community, we find that the money management or the financial literacy part, it's actually really easy. You kind of lift this kind of burden or this limiting beliefs on people, and it just opens up their minds. So I think that truth-telling part here will open up a lot more opportunity and prosperity.
It's a really good point to mention with that context, especially, I guess, thinking the capability element. Part of that is, what do I feel I'm able to do? What am I capable of? And are there things that subconsciously hold me back because I don't think I'm smart enough to manage money, or I don't think it's for me, or I think that only a certain kind of person can have, that understanding of finance or that access to financial literacy support, financial advice. And I think some of the work that you've led, Phil, really highlights how you can break it down and just make it accessible, make it something that, it doesn't need to be overwhelming. It's how do you understand what's coming in, what's going out? How do you understand the right buffer to have, and giving them the confidence that you can absolutely do this, just work with us and kind of let's work together to make it easier and break it down. Otherwise, it's one of these things that it's like when you've got a bill you need to pay, it just sits there and it's stressful and it's looming over you and you're just not getting to it. So I think that's a really powerful point. It kind of leads me to my next question, I guess, that we have kind of been touching on with the relationship with government, financial services. I think there's a role of, academia, education, potentially health services, housing. There's a lot of different roles to be played, and you've spoken about the relationship between them all. But I'd love to hear from both of you in terms of, is there, who has the greatest role to play? Is there one kind of institution that does have a bigger role to play, for example, government or financial services, or is it more the individual capability building? What do you think in terms of what could make the biggest impact? Phil, I might start with you there.
Yeah, I think the lens to look at this is probably kind of two cohorts. The one where we're talking inclusion, making sure everyone's kind of getting access to what's really the bare minimum of doing business. If you're a super fund or a bank, you should be able to service your customers as just a requirement of being in business in existence. And then the other one is really shifting the dial forward for First Nations people. So we look at the first cohort, and when I was the chair of the First Nations Superannuation Working Group and Super Summit, some of the systemic issues, like identification to access your super early or for estate planning was a real challenge. Having the 100 points of ID, telling that to someone in regional or remote community means not much at all. But it was kind of the strict process for the super fund. And something that was able to kind of meet in the middle was government allowing for alternate forms of identification for First Nations people, which was kind of a really good kind of economic reconciliation example where both were able to meet sort of in the middle. So I think looking at those basic areas and how you can better service customers. The other one's kinship structures and how that plays out in estate planning for superannuation. That's definitely a role for, I think, probably more the sector, because there is flexibility around that. It's just being educated and understanding those kinship structures. And then once we have kind of the basis stuff, I think I see the industry having more flexibility than the government when it comes to prosperity and looking at ways that they might be able to allocate capital for First Nations businesses that isn't all about, if I lend out at this amount, I get this amount back. Is there a way to be more patient with that capital, knowing that it's probably the first time or first generation those First Nations persons run a business, and how can you kind of lend out capital knowing that the impact's going to be better? They're more likely to employ First Nations people. They're more likely to have a community focus and have that social impact element rather than just a pure commercial gain. So I think much more on the sector than government for me.
Yeah, and really good point about the limitations of documentation processes. You have these specific processes that enable that limit inclusion, and that is how do you then go from there if you can't get access to what you need. Adam, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I just think in the broader question of roles, I think that's been one of the challenges is that sort of financial well-being and financial inclusion in a way sits in between all of these different sectors, and they can't be resolved by any one sector. And in a way, I think each sector was kind of pointing at the other one, saying like, "Oh, we're not the lead for this. That's probably financial institutions that should be driving this work." So I think really for us, we could probably debate which one has the larger influence and roles and set of tools to drive financial well-being. But at the end of the day, I think the real gains are going to be made when these sectors start to deepen their understanding and empathy of what's going on the ground, what's happening in households, and how each of them plays a role in terms of improving financial well-being for others. I like what you were saying, Phil, around the truth telling, and I think sort of kind of building on that is just visibility. I think for some of these industries, they actually don't know how citizens, people with low income, indigenous populations are actually experiencing their services, their products, their policies. And we've started to, and we need to do a lot more as a sector, but tell those stories, do more of that ethnographic and case studies and share those with those stakeholders, because I do think once they see some of those barriers and challenges with access, they become committed and interested in solving that issue as well. And so for us, what we are starting to see is, for example, we may have a fairly robust social safety net, a lot of benefits for individuals that are struggling. But what we're noticing is that the plumbing to get those benefits to households is very rickety and rusty, and that's invisible to a lot of people that work within policy and in government. And so we have an opportunity to show them how certain groups, especially people with disabilities, just have a horrendous time accessing particular benefits, and where are ways that they could do better. Similarly, with financial services, I think that they have not been prioritizing financial inclusion and vulnerable populations. I think that's something where there's a lot of gains to be made for them to deepen their understanding around those that are not financially included. Why are people going to high cost lenders or payday lenders? Like, what's happening there, and what might be opportunities to provide greater help for households? So for me, really, the magic's going to happen when we get these different sectors together, including people with lived experience and who are struggling currently, to understand each other, to understand what roles and ways we could each be contributing towards solutions, and then starting to collaborate on some of those particular solutions. At the end of the day, if you were forcing me to say who has the biggest role, I think it starts with government. I think government sets the tone in terms of consumer protection, policies, sets the rules for industries. They hold the purse strings for investing in large service networks like financial counseling and financial capability. They have roles in terms of influence, in terms of convening. So I would say government is a critical one to be at the table and to leading these conversations. But I think all other sectors have to be there in good faith and actively trying to figure out how they can be contributing to solutions.
Yeah, it's a really good way to highlight the collaboration that's needed, but also the leadership of government and the specific consideration for financial services. You mentioned payday lending. There's so much you could say just regarding financial services and the products and the access and what products are easier to access, potentially the ones that are more harmful. There's lots of contributing factors there, but really like your point and really highlighting the collaboration that's necessary. Now, if we look to the future, the NAIDOC theme for the next generation is, I think, worth us talking about when we think about the next generation of leaders and activists who will play such a critical role in the future. Phil, what do you see the role being for the next generation, and how do you think they can really drive impact for the future?
It's really timely question, obviously being the NAIDOC theme, but the day we're recording this, there was a piece in the Australian from Anna Perera-Shaw talking about this concept, and she spoke about it at the IATSIS conference around it's been a lot of the same people, herself included, for 30 to 40 years driving the policy and systemic change. And now it's time for elders to, kind of pass that on and coach the next generation, but without going completely silent. So we are going through a bit of a transition. A lot of our old people have been doing this for a long time. And I think they're probably mentally and emotionally exhausted, because this space takes its toll. It's exhausting doing this kind of 24/7 in Aboriginal affairs. And I think the real almost coming of age moment for the next generation of leaders was sitting there on October 14 and seeing the referendum results come in. I think that really shifted the concept that I talked to a lot of young Aboriginal leaders and that next generation that we class it as, and we've always had the approach that if we're reasonable with our requests, we'll get reasonable results, because we haven't grown up in that isolation as much of our elders. We haven't been segregated. We haven't been, to a certain extent, kind of kicked out of places because of our Aboriginality. So I think we've kind of gone in with that more collaborative approach towards doing this. But I think that was a real shift in the sentiment, where being reasonable isn't going to kind of be enough. And certainly I think my sentiment really changed to I look at two kind of approaches to Indigenous affairs, and taking inspiration from that American context. You've got a bit more of that Martin Luther King approach, where you're protesting, you're doing the right thing, you're looking at policies, you're looking at governments working in that context. But then you look at the Malcolm X approach, where it's achieving social justice through any means necessary. And I really relate to that any means necessary part so much more after that referendum, because it's so vital in being able to do that. So I think, there's going to be a shift in the approach for for the next generation. And I think wherever we can, having something First Nations controlled and owned is going to be the biggest step forward. Even if we look at the native title funds, we talk about however many billions that's worth. We dig deep into that. It's not Indigenous people that are managing the finances. It's your big perpetuals of the world that are managing the money. First Nations people are just kind of the beneficiaries of that. So I think looking in all contexts, where can it be First Nations owned and more importantly, controlled?
Yeah, absolutely. And also highlighting the importance of First Nations businesses, leaders, really having those voices and really listening to them as well. I think there's a lot of times where perhaps the wrong people are kind of speaking, and I think it's really good to highlight when it's the lived experience or it's people who, are the right people to be talking about that. So really, really good point about who's managing this behind the scenes, but also how do you build up that next generation? Because some of the people who've been leading a lot of this discussion, you're right, it's been a long time. There's some incredible people who've had strong voices for decades, and it's exciting to see who else will be really leading some of these discussions, these movements. But of course, it's disheartening when things happen as well that aren't as we expect. Adam, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think there is a lot of voices that haven't been heard, and I think there's an opportunity. You mentioned young people, but also Indigenous communities and other vulnerable populations who just have not been at the table, who have not been part of or empowered or supported to be leaders in some of this work. And I think that's something that we're keenly trying to figure out how we can be allies and supporters to really kind of lift up and elevate and shine a light and support these different perspectives and really try and find our own way to nurture and coach and encourage more diversity in terms of voices and perspectives. And that's going to make our policies, our services, our programs that much stronger. And I think that's something that is core to the values of being Canadian and something we want to keep on reflecting on and leaning into. I'd also make the point that I feel like, the economy and the economic context that we're living in right now is not the same one as our parents or our grandparents. But yet still they are the decision makers. And in many ways, they impose judgment on the younger generation around not being able to get a handle of their financial well-being and financial security. But I'm seeing a lot of young people and young professionals that are trying to use the old playbook of achieving financial security and financial well-being. They're going to school, they're getting the university degree, and they're going out in the world, and they're having a really hard time. They're struggling with, student loans. They're struggling to get a foothold in a strong paying job that's going to cover all their bills. And then they go to look at the housing market in some sectors, and it's just unattainable. And so the pathways that people built security, assets, savings, and well-being for themselves and future generations feel like they're out of reach for many individuals. And so I think we need to reckon with the fact that that young people are having a tougher go in some cases, and we need to bring them into these conversations and figure out how we can work together to solve them, not just blame the victim kind of thing, which seems to be happening quite a bit in terms of people thinking that it's their own ingenuity that got them the level of security they have, but yet young people are making bad choices. It just doesn't seem to be playing out in reality. So I think there's a real opportunity. I appreciate all the work that you are all doing, the work that Phil's doing, and the work that we and our partners are doing to expand financial well-being for individuals. But I think at the same time, I like the idea and the question of making sure that we continue to lift up those voices and encourage other leaders to be able to participate in some of these solutions.
It's a really great point, Adam, in terms of, we want to empower individuals to be financially capable, financially literate, which leads to wellness and resilience, but it's not exclusively up to the individual to be able to control that outcome, because there's a lot of institutional barriers, there's a lot of limitations, even with the documentation we mentioned, or the barriers, there's a lot of challenges that even you could have the best literacy and there are still these roadblocks. And I think it's really important to make the point, like you mentioned, that it's not anyone's fault for being where they are. You can give them everything. You can kind of provide all the tools and everything, but there's a lot of things that are out of people's control that it's really important to recognize. And I think when we spoke about collaboration and the role of government and financial services and kind of the industry to make changes, make things easier, make things more accessible, give people better access to funding that's available, that's, I think, a really good point, that there's things that individuals can be empowered to do to make their situation better, but there's also big changes, society, government, etc. So I think there's been some really good themes coming through from both of you. And Vinita, I'll hand over to you to conclude our session. But yeah, thank you both for the themes and perspective you've shared today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anna. And thank you, Phil and Adam. So many of the things that you've talked about are so vital for everyone to learn. And, I've been taking notes all the way through. And some of the things that I'd like to highlight that I think are really important for our listeners as well is how interlinked social, economic, physical, financial, and mental health and well-being are. The person is at the center and all aspects of health are interlinked. And I think very often that missing piece that you've talked about, not recognizing the role of money and managing money well in actually enabling all other aspects of health, are so important. So that's a really important factor that I'd like to highlight. The second thing that you've talked about, both of you, is the need for the system to change along with the individual. The whole concept of macro, meso, and micro change needs to happen so that the system can support individuals to achieve their best. And I loved your reflection, Adam, that the playbook that the elders had has actually changed. So it's not just following what the elders had achieved and then looking to see why the young are not catching up. It's also recognizing the playbook needs to change alongside. And I loved your reflection, Phil, on the fact that, in terms of accessing even retirement funding, the life expectancy of certain groups is different. So you cannot have the same playbook for them in terms of building their wealth and being able to access retirement and, aged care, for example. Even that is an issue that needs to be acknowledged. And last but not least, I loved the fact that both of you have acknowledged that the entire system needs to work together to have collective change. And without sounding selfish or big noting a particular thing, Adam and Phil, as you know, there was a program that we set up when we were at Good Shepherd Microfinance. It was called the Financial Inclusion Action Plan Program. And that program was kicked off in 2016 with government funding, Adam. So, definitely recognizing the role of the government in pulling together all of the sectors. And we had the government working with the financial services industry, with academia and researchers, along with community organizations, making public commitments in terms of what they would do to improve financial well-being under the banner of financial well-being is everyone's business. And I can't help thinking that sometimes we need to go back to those action plans rather than just talk, so that it's not just waiting for somebody else to come in and solve the problem, as you mentioned, Adam. It's every single sector taking its own responsibility and doing what it can to make a difference. So thank you again for a wonderful webinar. And what I'd like to say is that it's not just a discussion forum. For us, we'd also like to be able to contact you in terms of practical ways in which we can make these big, lofty ambitions happen. And I wish each of you the very best as we head into NAIDOC Week, and hope that we can all continue in our own pathways of making financial resilience and well-being a reality for everyone. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much.